Hello, my name is Ciara Flaherty, and this is my FemFest contribution for 2022. The author that I'll be looking at is Judith Kerr, and she was a very influential writer who was German born and lives in England up until her death in 2019. She wrote many influential books, as you can see in the illustration of her here, with the tiger came to tea, Moog, the cat there. So we can see that they were mostly children's books that she wrote, as well as this, what we'll mostly look at in this presentation on the topic of exile is the book that she wrote called When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, which is a child's view into exile, having to move to different countries, coping with being a refugee during the war period. And that's why I chose to look at Judith Kerr, because it's so interesting. I think it's very interesting to look at this different viewpoint of the war, such an innocent look at the war, which we will discuss, and also we'll discuss how that book was basically written about her life, that her and the main character Anna in the book are very much so the same person. How they both look at war as a child, because she was a child during the war, and I think that's very interesting to look at. So a bit more about Judith Kerr. That's her on the right there. So she was born in Berlin to Alfred and Julia Kerr, and her father Alfred was quite an influential writer at the time. He was very much so an anti-Nazi and did write about how bad it was. So of course when Hitler came into power, when Judith was just a young child, they searched for him, and that's mentioned in the book that will be talked about, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. So he was sought after, so they had to flee. So they emigrated to many different countries during their exile. So first of all, they fled to Switzerland. They stayed there for a while. Then they had to flee to France and then to England. So Judith Kerr, much like the character in the book, which I'll talk about later, had to live in many different places and felt kind of like an outcast in all of them, at such a young age as well, having to adjust to so many different cultures and languages, places, ways of life. That's all talked about in her book, and obviously it must have been very difficult for such a young child to have to cope with all of this going on. So they stayed in England. That's where they resided permanently, and she has lived there up until she died in 2019. So we have down here, she worked for the Red Cross and got offered a scholarship to study in England due to that. As mentioned, she mostly wrote her books for her children. That's how she started writing. Her children wanted her to tell her story, so she started the Moog series, which was mentioned with the tiger, and they all became very famous and very well known. And also down here, she was appointed the OBE in 2012 for service in children's literature and Holocaust education. So this can show that her books and her writings made people aware of what had happened during the war, what she has seen, and it educated people on it, and a different viewpoint of seeing it, of course, through that child's eyes in When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. So here's just an example of some of the literary texts that Judith Kerr has written. There's so many of them, so many in the Moog series, which is about this little cat, very much so targeted towards children. So some of those I have here include The Tiger Came to Tea, which could be pictured down the bottom picture, the third picture there. Moog the Forgetful Cat, Goodbye Moog, and Moog's Birthday, and so on and so forth. That was a very influential line of texts. So many books written about this one cat, Moog. To finish off that series, she calls it bittersweet the way she ended it, the Goodbye Moog is where Moog, pictured in the first picture here, him flying away, he dies, and it's a very bittersweet end to that series, that she has said that brought such unexpected success to her. What we'll be mostly looking at in this presentation, as mentioned, is the Out of Hitler Time trilogy. And this includes When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, Bombs on Aunt Dainty, and Small Person Far Away. And we'll be looking at When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. That can be pictured in the second picture there, and that was one of the covers for the book of the character Anna and her father. And you can see the Eiffel Tower, different buildings, how they had to flee, and the backpack on her, moving to all these different countries as mentioned. So that's the text we'll be looking at. So of course, as mentioned before, there are many comparisons between When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit and Judith Kerr's life herself. It's almost parallel. It was basically written about her life during that time. So there is a quote here. She used her own life as inspiration for most of her work, claiming that a story was never good if she made it up from scratch. That's pretty much proof in itself of how this book is basically almost a biography of her life during that time. We could see here her family in the background, her mother and father and her brother, and Judith Kerr herself. This was them during the time in which this book was based. Judith Kerr's full name is Anna Judith Kerr, Anna being the main character's name in the book. And much like the father in the book being a very famous writer, Alfred Kerr himself was a writer, and a very famous one, as mentioned. Furthermore, the character Anna in the book has an older brother, and Judith Kerr also had an older brother. So Michael and Max. Two very similar names. So yeah, this basically shows how this book is about her life, and we can take it then as an example of what she has gone through during her time in exile and things she's seen. So a bit more about Alfred Kerr and his influence on Judith Kerr becoming a writer. I wanted to include a translation in this presentation because with Judith Kerr residing in England, English kind of became her main language, so she wrote all of her books in English. So there's not much to translate in terms of German to English. But there is this quote that I was guided to that talks about how proud her dad would have been with her writing success and the success of her literature, him being very successful himself. So I just wanted to read it, and in the next slide then there'll be a translation of it, which kind of puts more into context of where Judith Kerr's love of writing might have come from, how she became so successful, and how proud he would be. So, Judiths Vater war stolz auf sie, wenn sie sehen konnte. Für Tochter ist das sehr wichtig, auch wenn sie schon 76 Jahre alt sind und ihr Vater schon lange nicht mehr lebt. Anwesend ist ohnehin. Mein Vater glaubte immer, dass ich Talent habe. Insofern war ich gar nicht überrascht von meinem Erfolg. Meine Mutter dagegen war sehr erstaunt, wenn sie mich heute sah. Sie war sich über meine Begabungen nie so sicher. So here's just the translation of that quote, and I'll just read it really quickly. Judith's father would have been proud of her if he could see her now. It's very important for daughters, even though they're 76 years old and their father is long gone. He is here anyway. My father always knew that I had a talent. In respect to this, he would not be surprised at my success. My mother, on the other hand, would be surprised if she saw me today. She didn't know much of my talents. So that's Judith Kerr speaking in the quote, in the latter half of that quote itself. And it is mentioned a lot in the book When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. Anna and her father spend much time together, and they're very close. So in that sense, we can take from this that perhaps Judith and her father, Alfred, would have been very close, and he would have seen how well she wrote, how much of a talent she had. He could probably tell it from her straight away. It's very funny then, on the other hand, how her mother could not see that. And perhaps that's because of the worries of the war. We can see in the book that the mother worries a lot about where they're going to go, you know, worry about her children, why certain things are happening to them. So yeah, this just shows the influence that her father must have had on her, how he would have been really proud of her now if he could see her. So just to reiterate before going into looking at this book through a child's eyes in exile, like how much they had to travel. So first of all, they had to leave their home country of Germany and settle in Switzerland, where at least they had kind of the same language, which, you know, must have helped with that a little bit. However, when they moved to France, the characters in the book and Judith Kerr had to learn French. So that must have been a huge culture shock, to have to, first of all, be resided in a country, make friends, and then have to move, and then have to move from that country again. And then, of course, they moved to England. So after a couple of years of living in France, finally getting a grasp of the language, they had to move once again, and they had to leave behind the friends they made, more of their family, everything they've learned culturally and socially in that country, and move again to a new place. And the book ends with them arriving in England, and one of the people working in the port saying, "There's no Hitler here." So they're finally safe from the war. That did strike me a lot while reading that book, When Hitler Sold Pink Rabbit, of how much the family had to move, and all the family, her mother and her father and her brother, everyone had to move to all these different places before settling down, over the couple of years that they were, and the stress and the uncertainty of what was going to happen probably weighed a lot, mostly on the parents. But then socially, for the two kids to have to, as mentioned, move and leave their friends behind, leave their work behind, leave everything they learned behind multiple different times in the span of a couple of years, must have weighed heavily on her. And we can see that a lot in the writing of When Hitler Sold Pink Rabbit. So taking from this, I wanted to look a lot on the effects of exile for children, that we can see in examples of the book When Hitler Sold Pink Rabbit through Anna's eyes. There's multiple different effects that we can see on Anna, how she has to try and comprehend war, and that's literally one of the first points, is that she can't, there's an improper comprehension of what's actually really going on, and she doesn't really understand it at first, if really truly at all, during the span of the book. So there's a few quotes from the book, specifically chapter 6, which is where this picture, this image is taken from. They're finally in Switzerland, they're kind of settling down. They've just moved out of Berlin. And Anna says, another person had compromised. What's compromise, wonder Anna? And all grown-up conversations were like this nowadays. That she doesn't fully understand what's going on, like what's happening. She doesn't get why her parents are having these adult conversations, as she said, and all grown-up conversations were like this nowadays, meaning very serious and very fearful, very uncertain. She doesn't fully get it because she's only a small child. They just think they're going away for a little bit, and they think of it as a holiday almost. So that must be a lot for her to kind of come to terms with that, if at all, at the start of the book. Secondly, as mentioned loads of times during this presentation, with the theme of exile, is moving around a lot and feeling kind of like an exile everywhere you go. So of course they moved to France. this is her trying to learn ballet, trying to fit in, trying to socially fit into this new place, trying not to feel so much like an exile in this country. And that does, of course, progress as time goes on, and she feels more and more like she belongs. So during her birthday in Paris, in one of the chapters, she says to her father, "I don't think I'm quite used to being one yet," meaning a refugee. And that just shows how isolated she must feel, that she doesn't, that they're constantly moving around, and she's kind of like, I don't really feel like I'm coping with this very well, or I'm not fully ready to be moving around. I don't feel like I should be one, or this is her, she knows this is her way of life now, that she is a refugee in so far 2 countries, and she's not used to being one, and that's really sad to see. However, towards the end of their stay in Paris, and they had to go back, she said going back to Paris felt more like going home than they ever would have thought possible. So when they first come to Paris, they come to France, they feel very isolated. They don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know the way they do things in school, the tests, the ways of life, how to do things. They don't know any of it. And then all of a sudden, as about 1.5 years passes, they get a grasp of the language, they get a grasp of the social ways of life. And then all of a sudden, the way it says it here, Paris felt more like going home than they ever would have thought possible. So they actually feel like they're going home, and that Paris is their home, and it's their new home, and they don't feel so isolated or like they're in exile anymore. It suddenly has become their home, and that's why it's so heartbreaking again when they have to move once more to England. And once again having that feeling of being in exile again in this new country of England. Like, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to think about. So that's another effect. And of course, she doesn't shy away from showing the realities of the war while still keeping it from the child's perspective. So there's this innocent one at the start when their relative's dog dies. Her and her brother kind of start blaming it on Hitler. It's Hitler's fault that this is happening and all these bad things are happening. This is kind of innocence, which will be talked about later. This innocence behind this way of logic that Hitler is the bad man and everything that is being caused to him is because of him. And in a way, it was at the time, but not the dog's death. And so there is this innocence that's really kept throughout the book, that it is a child that we're looking at and her way of thinking during this. There's upsetting things that happen to them while they're in Switzerland. German family come on holidays and they start throwing shoes at them because they are Jewish and because their parents they support Hitler, so they get things thrown at them. And of course then it does, as mentioned, they have to move so much. It's the realities of being a refugee. And it's a very sad image there of Anna, kind of, everyone else looks very happy but she looks quite sad, like quite isolated. She doesn't comprehend what's going on at all. So it's that sadness behind it as well. Of course, one of the family's friends and relatives, they don't make it. In the case of Uncle Julius, he dies as a result of the war and being a Jew. That happens at the end of the book, and it's so upsetting to kind of that they're so happy and then next minute they see people who didn't make it out kind of falling around them. And of course the realities of making friends and family is mentioned in these new places, making these friends, especially as a child, and then having to leave them and not knowing if you'll ever see them again. And that was the same for them leaving Berlin, that the parents probably knew that they mightn't see these people again, or they don't know when they were going to see these people again. There's this innocence again that they thought it was going to be for only a little while, and then the reality of it hits that they might never see these people again. It's very upsetting and shows how much fear especially for a child, they must be during this time. Finally, there is a bit of humour in the innocence of Anna during this situation, during this very awful and traumatic and historical situation, and she's still so childlike sometimes. Like at the start of the book, when they have to leave for Switzerland, it seemed incredible. So for her at the time, when leaving, it was like a holiday and it was brilliant, and they didn't have to go to school the next day, and you know, the joys of not having to go to school because they had to leave the country because they could die if they stayed, and she doesn't know that. So it provides this kind of comedic relief almost to it. Of course, they leave some stuff behind, and that's where the name of the story comes from. Her stuffed animal is left behind, and she says, "Oh, maybe Hitler has stolen it," which shows again innocence. Furthermore, when her father, there's an ad put in the newspaper to find him, that there's a price on his head, and Anna doesn't really get that. She takes it quite literally and dreams of money falling on them, like killing them in her sleep. She doesn't get the kind of that's not serious, that it's not literally that he has a price on his head. And the excitement then when she finally gets to learn French, when she finally grasps the language without even thinking about it, one day it just clicks. And the excitement because she finally feels like she belongs. All this innocence of this poor girl who's going through so much is very prominent in this story as well. So there was a lot learned during this me doing this presentation and this contribution. I really find it quite valuable. First of all, the importance of literature during these times. So there's so many more people who are doing, so many more authors who were in exile during this time, many of my classmates, and to look at all of them and to show how they expressed themselves during these times and the works of art that they kind of produced during this time. And reading that today can kind of show the effects, the importance that we should try not to let this stuff happen again. The importance of different perspectives as well, that all of these authors might have been adults and all that, writing these poetry, but looking at it from a different perspective, looking at it from a child who has to go through war. It's such a different perspective than an adult who can comprehend it. It's interesting to look at those different perspectives. And of course the realities of the situations of war were shown very prominently in this book. And it kind of makes you think forward to what's happening today, of course, in Ukraine, that there's children who have to leave their countries, that there's people who have to flee their countries and they're now in exile. The same things kind of keep happening, and it's important to kind of raise awareness of this. And I was thinking about that a lot when I was doing this presentation, kind of it's happening again, that people have to leave their countries, that they're in exile, that they don't know where they're going to go, that they might have to learn new languages, that they might have to grasp new ways of life, they might never see people again that they leave behind, like fathers and men who have to stay and fight. It's heartbreaking that it's happening again, but again it's raising this awareness, becoming aware of the realities of it and trying our best to be aware, be conscious of what's happening and trying our best to kind of help. I think that's very important. I was thinking about that a lot while doing this presentation. So yeah, this presentation has been very eye-opening in terms of current events and in terms of the world today, the world that it was. Putting myself in a person in exile's shoes, thinking about the ways that they live their lives, the ways they have to cope, thinking about that and how heartbreaking it is, it really opened my eyes, I think. So here's just some of my references. These are my references that I used for quotes for. And then these are just the references of the images that I used during this presentation. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope it kind of showed the effects of exile on people overall and of children during war times. So thank you.